You don't belong here anymore, Elena. Dad left everything to me. The words echoed louder than the clink of glasses and the soft music playing in the background. We were standing in the middle of my father's old study, the same place I used to sit in his lap and listen to stories about loyalty and family. Now, that very room had become the stage for betrayal. My brother, Mark, held out a manila folder with a smug look on his face, while guests outside still laughed and drank, oblivious to what was happening inside. "You're joking, right?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, not because I was unsure, but because the air had been knocked out of my lungs. "No joke. Dad rewrote the will. I own everything now." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just looked him in the eye and smiled. "My name is Elena Carter, and I'm 32 years old." I wasn't always calm in the face of betrayal. But that day, that smile I gave Mark wasn't fake. It was born out of something much deeper, a quiet rage mixed with years of lessons I never thought I'd need to use against my own blood. Growing up, I was the child who stayed in the background, the responsible one, while Mark, 2 years younger, was the loud favorite, Dad's shadow and pride. He broke windows and was forgiven. I brought home trophies and got told not to brag. Still, I never held it against him. I thought that's just how families worked. Dad owned a mid-sized logistics company. Nothing flashy, but solid, legacy-built. I spent every summer helping in the office, running spreadsheets, shadowing operations. Mark, on the other hand, barely showed up. When he did, he'd flirt with receptionists, disappear by lunch, and return only to grab Dad's keys and borrow the car. But still, Dad adored him. The heartbreak came slowly, in layers. When Mom died, I moved back in. I left a promising corporate job to manage the household and help Dad with the business. I cooked, cleaned, answered calls, even slept in the hospital during Dad's surgeries. I still remember how cold those chairs were. I remember pressing warm soup against his palm when he could barely lift a spoon. "I don't know what I'd do without you, baby girl," he whispered one night. I believed him. I never asked for anything. Not money. Not a title. Just trust. Just the hope that one day, when the time came, he'd see who truly stood by him. And he did, or so I thought. The old version of the will had both our names. I saw it once years ago when Dad asked me to read it over for grammar. But that day in the study, Mark handed me a newer version. Legal.
Signed.
Stamped.
With only his name on it.
No explanations. No letters. Just silence. And a signature. All I could hear in my head was Grandma Rose's voice. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. I placed the folder gently on the desk and looked at Mark. He was so sure of himself, his eyes gleamed with victory. "Actually," I said softly, pulling out a small black flash drive from my purse, "you might want to take a look at this before you gloat any further." His brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to be?" I leaned in, calmly, too calmly, and plugged it into Dad's old laptop still sitting on the side table. The screen flickered to life. I clicked one file. It was a video. Dad sat in his favorite chair, weak but clear-minded, speaking directly into the camera. "If anything happens to me, I want this to be heard. Mark has no idea what this company takes to run. Elena does. I've changed the structure of my holdings. The will may say one thing, but the control documents say another. Elena knows where they are. She deserves everything." Mark's face drained of color. I slid over a slim envelope sealed with wax. Inside it was a notarized document, power of attorney signed just a week before Dad passed. "I may not have the house," I said, voice steady, "but I have full controlling interest in Carter Freight Logistics." I stood up slowly. "And since you work there, little brother, I guess that makes me your boss now." Mark's mouth opened to argue, but nothing came out. For once, he had nothing to say. "You're bluffing," Mark said, his voice trembling. "Dad wouldn't do that. He told me, he trusted me." I remained silent for a moment, just looking at him. That was the first time I saw it. Fear in his eyes. Real, genuine fear. Not for Dad's legacy. Not for the truth. But for the power he thought was slipping through his fingers. I'm not bluffing, Mark, I said. I've known about this for months. I didn't say anything because I wanted to believe you had enough decency not to take what wasn't yours. Mark lunged for the document, but I held it tighter. Don't, I warned. This is legally binding. You'll embarrass yourself. He sat back down and rubbed his hands over his face, suddenly desperate. This isn't fair, he muttered. You always acted like you were better than me. Dad always made me feel like I had to compete just to breathe. You didn't have to compete, I said, shaking my head. You just had to show up. But you didn't. You were too busy chasing comfort while I was taking care of him, of everything. Mark's wife, Rachel, had been standing near the door the entire time. She'd come with him, supportive at first, but now her posture was different. Defensive. Almost ashamed. I didn't know about the power of attorney, she said quietly. Mark told me everything was his. That your dad left in the business as a reward. I gave her a small nod. That's what he wanted everyone to think. Rachel looked at her husband. You lied to me. You made us invest our savings into a house we can't afford without this job. Mark stood up sharply. I did it for us. For our future. No, Mark. I cut in. You did it for control. Just like you always have. He turned back to me, suddenly hostile. You think running a company makes you better? You think you're some kind of saint? You've always been cold, Elena. You hide behind your work like it makes you worthy. That one stung, but I didn't flinch. I hide behind my work because it's the one thing I've built that no one could take from me, until now. You tried, Mark. You tried to erase me from Dad's memory. But you forgot one thing, he wasn't blind. Mark scoffed. You think people are going to follow you? I've been running the daily ops since Dad got sick. I tilted my head.
Exactly.
And that's why half our major clients were threatening to pull out before I stepped in behind the scenes. Mark froze.
Yeah.
I've been cleaning up your messes for 6 months now. You were too busy bragging to notice. Rachel sat down, stunned. Oh my God. I thought the late hours were just stress. I pulled out my phone and showed them emails. Client complaints, missed shipments, slashed contracts. You almost buried this company in your ego, I said. Mark looked pale. So what now? You fire me? You humiliate me in front of everyone. I sighed.
No.
I don't want revenge, Mark. I want order. So here's what I'm offering. He looked up, wary. You can stay on payroll for 3 months as a consultant. After that, you walk away. Quietly. I'll give you a severance package and a reference that won't mention this. His face twisted. You're kicking me out of the company Dad built. No, I replied. I'm protecting it. Like I always have. For a moment, the room was thick with silence. Rachel broke it. Elena, I don't know what to say. You don't owe me anything, I said gently. But you might want to start asking yourself what you and your kids really need from him moving forward. Mark collapsed into the chair, deflated. He didn't argue again. He just sat there, small and quiet, like the boy who used to break things and cry his way out of consequences. Only now there was no one left to cover for him. That night, after everything unfolded, I sat alone in my father's office. The same wooden chair. The same faint scent of his aftershave still lingering in the air. His old reading glasses still perched atop a leather-bound book on the shelf. A part of me wanted to cry, but the tears didn't come. Not yet. I looked at the dusty family photo on his desk, me, Dad, and Mark, taken over a decade ago. Back when smiles came easier, when I believed we were all on the same team. What a lie that turned out to be. But in that moment, something strange happened. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt peace. Not because the confrontation was easy, but because I had finally stood up for myself. For what was rightfully mine. For the truth. The next morning, I called a full company meeting. Employees gathered in the break room, murmuring and confused. Some had caught wind of what happened. Others were simply nervous. I stood at the front, heart pounding in my chest but face calm. I know many of you are wondering about recent changes. I began, voice steady. Let me be clear. The company is stable. It's in good hands. And we're about to step into a chapter that honors both the legacy of my father and the values he built this company on. There was a pause, then applause. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. It came from the people who'd seen me showing up every day without the title, who finally knew the truth behind the silence I had carried for months. Afterward, Jasmine, one of the senior managers, approached me. "You don't know this," she said, "but your dad once told me privately that you were the reason he could sleep at night. He said, 'My Elena, she's got a quiet fire. She'll never need to shout to be heard.'" My throat tightened. That sounded exactly like him. Over the following weeks, I made steady changes, not out of vengeance but out of purpose. I restructured the leadership team, brought in new consultants to rebuild trust with clients, gave underpaid employees the raises they deserved. People started smiling in the halls again. The tension that had ruled the company under Mark's reign began to dissolve. As for Mark, he kept to himself during those last 3 months. He came in late, avoided eye contact. I knew he was ashamed, and part of me pitied him. But I didn't let that pity rule me. On his final day, he handed in his badge without ceremony. He stood in my doorway, unsure. "I guess this is it," he muttered. I nodded.
Yeah.
"It is." He hesitated. "I didn't think you had it in you." "I know," I replied. "That's why I had to prove it to myself before I could prove it to you." There was a flicker in his eyes. A long-lost version of the brother I used to look up to. "Take care of the place," he said, almost whispering. "I already am," I answered. He left without another word. A few days later, Rachel called me privately. "I've moved back in with my parents," she told me. "I needed space to think. Everything you said, it woke me up." I didn't realize how much of myself I'd given up supporting his illusion. I listened. I didn't judge. She continued, "Thank you, not just for the truth, but for showing me that a woman can choose boundaries and still have heart." That hit me harder than I expected. See, revenge would have been easy. Public shaming, lawsuits, media exposure. I had the evidence, the means, the motive. But what I chose instead was harder. It required strength without cruelty. It demanded grace. And it gave me back something more powerful than revenge ever could. One afternoon, I volunteered at the local Women's Entrepreneurship Center, something Dad always said he'd do when he retired. I share my story, not the legal parts, not the company parts, but the emotional ones. The betrayal. The silence. The moment I chose to stop begging for respect and start claiming it. Afterward, a young woman approached me. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "My brother stole my college fund," she said. "I thought I was stupid for letting it happen." I took her hand gently. "You're not stupid. You're trusting. And that's not a weakness. But it does mean you need to learn how to protect your light."
She cried.
I did too. Helping her helped me. It reminded me that my story wasn't just for me. It was a roadmap for others. A cautionary tale, yes, but also a beacon. By the end of that month, I implemented a mentorship program at the company for women returning to work after caregiving breaks, for people like me who'd been quietly carrying everything alone for too long. No more silence. No more invisibility. I was no longer the shadow behind my father's success. I was the architect of my own legacy. 6 months later, the office looked nothing like it once did. The cold, corporate gray walls had been repainted in soft, warm tones, sage greens, honey browns, touches of lavender near the reception area. The energy inside was completely different. There was laughter now. Lightness. The break room smelled like cinnamon muffins that someone had brought in to share. Fresh flowers stood in glass jars on every desk, a tradition I started to celebrate small victories, birthdays, deal closures, even just a good week. It wasn't just the building that changed. I had changed. I was no longer walking in my father's shadow or under Mark's pressure. I had stepped into my own space, unapologetically, fully, and with grace. Outside, the courtyard that used to be empty was now alive. There were benches, a tiny herb garden, a mural painted by a local artist inspired by the theme, "Rebuild, don't retaliate." The centerpiece? A phoenix rising quietly from a pile of feathers. Not flames, feathers. Because rebirth doesn't always have to be loud to be powerful. I remember standing in front of that mural one late afternoon, watching the sun lower behind it, golden and soft. My thoughts drifted to my dad. I wished he could see this, what I had built, what I had become. But somehow I felt him there, as if the quiet breeze brushing my cheek was his silent nod of approval. That weekend, we hosted a baby shower for Jasmine in the very hall where I once had to listen to Mark dictate who belonged and who didn't. Now, the room was filled with balloons, music, and women in leadership positions, laughing freely, supporting one another. At one point, Jasmine stood up and said, "Elena didn't just save this company. She saved us. She reminded us that you don't need to roar to lead. You just need to stand." My throat closed. I didn't expect recognition, but it meant the world. Even Rachel showed up. She brought a gift, stayed quiet, but when we made eye contact, she gave me a nod. One that said, "I see you now. I understand." We never became close friends, but we shared something now, clarity, freedom, and that was enough. Later that night, I found myself sitting at my father's favorite cafe, one I hadn't visited since his funeral. A quiet little place with soft jazz, a tiny corner bookshelf, and the world's best lemon tea. I opened a notebook and began to write. Not about revenge, not about loss, but about renewal. How a heart breaks and builds at the same time. How betrayal can crack you open, but it's your choice what grows from the space it leaves behind. On the last page of the journal, I wrote the words he once told me at the kitchen table during a hard high school year. "You don't have to scream to be heard, Elena. When you speak from truth, the right people always listen." He was right. My voice had been inside me all along, waiting for permission I thought I needed. But I never did. I just had to listen to it myself first. Now, every week, I mentor 2 young women through our new leadership pipeline. I tell them the truth, not sugar-coated or wrapped in fairy tales. I tell them, people you love will betray you. Sometimes, they'll think they're helping. Other times, they'll know exactly what they're doing. You can't control them, but you can control who you become in response. And that makes all the difference. A few days ago, I walked through the company in trance and caught sight of a photo that stopped me in my tracks. It was the one from years ago, Dad, Mark, and me, but someone had reframed it with a handwritten quote underneath. "Foundations are built by those who keep showing up, even when no one sees them." I smiled, because now they see me, not as the overlooked sister, not as the fallback option, not even just as the owner. They see me as I am, a woman who is broken, who chose growth over bitterness, and who transformed betrayal into legacy. And in that final moment of this journey, I stepped out into the sunlit courtyard, the scent of rosemary and lavender filling the air, laughter echoing behind me, and I realized I wasn't just healing a company or reclaiming what was mine. I was building something entirely new. A life, a legacy, a future where I no longer waited to be chosen. I chose myself.